Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me. I get really kind of nervous when I do these. I don't know why. I've done a lot of them, but every time it's like a new game, a new thing. So I want to thank you so much for being here, for being ready to go on time. Just to give you a little bit of background on this, I initially did this webinar for other festival directors, and I forgot to record it, and I promised them I would have a recording. So I offered it again, and to do it for just to make an audience here, so that I wouldn't be in my house doing it by myself to have the recording. So thank you so much for participating, for being here. If for some reason you do have to duck out or get to other work, we will be sending out the recording to everyone. My plan is to work through the content. It takes about half hour, 45 minutes, and then to answer one-on-one questions. So if there's those of you who over the course of the conversation, your question isn't answered, you can just hang tight till the end and I will answer every question until we're done and it's exhausted. If you don't know me, my name is Jael Richardson. I am an author. I'm also the artistic director for the Festival of Literary Diversity, or FOLD. We have Big Fold and Little Fold now, we call them. So we have a festival for adult content, young adult to adult content in the spring. And then we host a festival for kids in the fall. And that goes from, 0 to, we give YA double dip. We double dip. So we put it in both places. But the festival is usually held in Brampton. And obviously with the pandemic, it moved to virtual. And so this presentation, this information is really a lot about what we did, how we did it, what we learned, what we shouldn't have done, all those kinds of things. And so I hope you find it informative. I will say it is largely geared towards, or my thinking is towards literary events. So if you're tuning in and you do other kinds of events and music events and different kinds of art spaces. Some of it might be applicable, some of it might not. Again, I'm happy to answer questions you might have at the end that might be more specific to what you're doing. So what I want to talk about today, or the things that I'm going to cover, I've listed there in the bottom right corner. I'm going to be going over the technology we used and the decisions we made behind the technology that we used, why we use what we use, and not so that that's the only way to do things, but I think it's really important to understand the thought process and the unique nature of an individual event, because I don't think virtual events are sort of a one size fit all, but I do think there's some key questions you want to ask yourself at the very beginning before you start sharing a link or promoting the event that will really help you serve your audience well. I also am going to talk about staffing, so what it looked like behind the scenes, how many people we needed, and what those sort of rules were, including one that we should have done that we didn't. I'm going to do a brief, I have one slide on accessibility. I'll talk a little bit about what we did there and what you can do for your events. I'll touch on a little bit of marketing, and I'll spend the end part talking about programming, which I think there's some really important things to think about when you're moving into a virtual space. The way that we do our Zoom events, so I like to set things up exactly how we do our events so you can have the experience of the audience and sort of say, oh, I liked that or I didn't like that. So we close the chat feature for all of our events. I will talk about that a little bit, but you can ask questions. There's a Q&A box. And so during this presentation, that's kind of the best way to go. If you have a question, pop it in the Q&A box. At various points, I'll check there and see if there's a question there, and I'll try and answer them. If not, I'll save it all to the end. And so that's the best way to communicate with me during this webinar. One of the things that's important, I think, we were very fortunate to be able to continue with our festival, and I'll talk very briefly about how that evolved. I also want to talk a little bit about what our festival is like normally, and therefore what made this such a big deal, or what sort of was exciting for us this past year. So our festival is typically held in one main venue in downtown Brampton, which is a suburb of Toronto. Toronto's obviously a huge space, lots of people, lots of literary events. Brampton does not have a lot of events at all, not even just literary, just not a lot of events. especially when you think about the sort of ones that are put on that are not put on by the city formally. And so we have very little tourism. There's not a lot of people who just come to Brampton for the sake of being in Brampton, although we're trying to change that. And so getting people to our festival is a challenge. It's a thing that has been a part of our experience since we began. Our first festival was in 2016. And we have had an audience anywhere from 500, now moving up closer to 1,000 over the last 5 years. That's how we've grown in terms of our physical space. And so we are smallish. When we're talking about festivals, that's pretty small in size. We have a particular challenge in terms of getting people out to our physical space in general. And so in March of this year, when things were looking dicey about having an in-person festival, and when the quarantine conversation started happening, we decided pretty early on to start looking carefully into doing a virtual festival. Why did we decide to go virtual? I think there was sort of 3 options. You could try and sort of hope that it would be okay and have your in-person event. You could cancel your event, or you could postpone it. Those were sort of the options we were looking at. And we decided, well, why don't we just keep it and go virtual? We had about 6 weeks to transition the whole festival. The festival had already been programmed. We had 29 events, if I recall, somewhere in the high 20 events planned. And we decided to take that schedule and be like our beginning place. And that's what's going to be different from a lot of you who are planning virtual events for the fall. Because we already had a program, we had to kind of adapt it and see, okay, these are the authors we have. How can we give them as much work as possible in this new format and this new framework? And so we took the festival and adapted it down to 19 events, 20 if you include our Pitch Perfect. So the authors were already invited, they were already confirmed, and so it was just about rejigging their schedule. Another thing to keep in mind is that we have done online events before. We do a program called Fold Academy, which is online webinars and writing workshops. And so we had spent the last 2 years evaluating different ways of delivering that content to a wider audience. We started out doing some on Facebook Live, wasn't particularly successful. We then moved to a webinar platform called Webinar Ninja, and we had a lot of problems with the internet. And so we were prior, just prior, we had a really bad experience with Webinar Ninja for like the 3rd time in a row. And so just prior to going with Fold virtual, we had decided to move our next webinar onto Zoom. And so it seemed like a natural transition to just put the whole festival on, especially when I did a webinar with Zoom. I watched their program and they showed how to do a panel with more than, 1 or 2 people. And so that's when I was like, oh, if we can do that, then we can do the whole festival. Essentially, we can definitely do workshops and we can definitely do our panels. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Zoom piece, because I think that again, when you're planning your virtual event, you're going to start with something. It's either going to be, we want it to work in our website, we want it to work in our budget, we want it to work in here. For us, the ease of use, the ease of use and the reliability, those were 2 really important factors. And so when we had used Zoom for meetings, for events, for just other things, we had never really had problems with the internet signal strength. We knew that it was really easy for people to get on. We knew that the audience could watch and participate just like you are doing now without having a Zoom account. You didn't even have to register. You could just plug in the webinar information and then use it. We also did 8 practice events before our official Fold events. And if I can say anything, I would say make sure you do a lot of practice events. It's really important that anyone who's using the technology gets really, really comfortable with it, so that they know exactly what people are seeing when they're presenting, and they also know exactly what to do when something needs to be fixed, changed, adapted, etc. Because we messed up a few times. I've messed up in the recordings. I've also messed up. We tried to do one on Facebook Live and link to YouTube Live, and there was issues where the buttons changed and I didn't know what to do. So it's really, really important, especially before your really high profile events, to do some practice events and make sure people get familiar with the software, the system, whatever it is you're using. Another reason we use Zoom was because of the backstage capacity. And so Zoom has a webinar feature. So the way Zoom works is you can do meetings, as I understand it, from a free account. You can do a lot of things from a free account. But when you want to actually do something like the way we're doing it now and the way we did it at Fold, is you're using the webinar feature. And the webinar feature is going to ask you to pay, and you're going to pay for the audience that you expect. So you can pay for 100, you can pay for, I think it's 500 or 1,000. And there's ways, there's tricky ways. They make it look like it's only 100 or 1,000, but you can actually get 500, which I think is sort of the magic spot, because you want to be able to have at least 100 and not have to worry about shutting people down. That's my opinion and approach. But the webinar feature on Zoom allows you to have up to 20 panelists or backstage users. And the good thing about having 20 panelists or backstage users is you want to think about your panelists as well as your staff. It's really useful to have staff behind the scenes doing things, looking at things, watching things. I'll show you what our staff was doing, but one of the things, for example, there were a lot of questions about Zoom security and like whether it was safe and all these things. And I have opinions about that are not, you know, I don't know everything about it, but when we Googled the things that people were complaining about with Zoom, they were also complaining about those things with Facebook. They were also complaining about those things with WhatsApp and all these other features. So we started to realize that like, it's probably okay, but we also probably need to take some security features to make sure people are safe. And so we turn the chat feature off so that people can't say horrible racist things in the middle of the event, which they were doing on Instagram Live and Facebook Live and things like that. When the audience has an opportunity to contribute to the conversation without your control, without your ability to shut them down, close them off, etc., it puts the authors, the presenters, whoever is your panelist, it puts them at risk. And so we really liked the idea that we could control what people can contribute to. One of the ways to limit or prevent Zoom bombing is also to just not have the audience have any ability to contribute content. So none of you can share your screen or participate in the event as speakers, and that can reduce those kinds of risks. But we did have staff backstage in virtual stage to make sure that wasn't happening. The Q&A feature is also really helpful. We like that. You could control that as well. It could go directly to the panelists. Everybody could see it. There's all sorts of things that you could do. You can build in polls and raise hand features, which we used in our kids events that were really popular. So we would ask the kids questions and they could press like, you know, what do bees make? And, you know, they could pick berries, honey, flowers, and they pick honey or whatever. So they can contribute to the conversation that way. They can raise their hand. We'll say, how many of you have ever been on an airplane? And they'll put the raise hand feature up. So we really like those features. Some of the other sort of, I wouldn't say competitors, but some of the other spaces that people are using, and I encourage you to look at a lot of different events and spaces to see what they're using and what you like and what you don't like. For me, Zoom has the capacity to link directly to Facebook Live and YouTube Live, if I recall correctly. We tried to use it once, but as I said, the buttons changed and I freaked out. And so it's like, we don't have any more practice events, so no, we can't do it. But you can make it so that as I'm doing this, it could be going to Facebook Live as well. We have not had a huge success in the number of people who participate in a Facebook Live event. And one of the things I think is a factor is Facebook Live, Instagram Live, they're very moment-based. So you tell people to go online, to go on social media at a particular time and be a part of a conversation. And they have to remember that. They generally have to find it on their own, or they already have to be on that social media platform to really reliably show up. And so for us, we use Zoom because it links with Eventbrite. And I'll show how that works in a second. And for us, our whole website was based around Eventbrite registrations for in-person events. So it felt very logical to continue that process and just change what happens for people on the back end. And so that's how we decided on it. We do some things on Instagram Live. We introduced our new Fold Kids Coordinator on Instagram Live. We did some preview events for our actual Zoom events on Instagram Live, but they were short, 15 to 20-minute pieces. We post them on our website. They're live for 24 hours or on your Instagram TV channel. So We have done things, but I think you want to think about each of your events differently. You want to think about if you're doing a series, you want to think about it, because I think Instagram Live and Facebook Live generally work well with shorter events. That's my opinion. They work well with events where people can just sort of be passing through. Our panels, we want people sitting down, we want people on Twitter talking about it. And so for us, we wanted them focused, and that for us became Zoom or some sort of like webinar platform. Again, if you find another one that does the same kind of thing, it's great. So this is the technology we used. In terms of subscriptions, in terms of money spent, Eventbrite didn't cost us anything, but the other two were things that we paid for. Zoom, we were already using it for our webinars. And so it was a matter of thinking about, okay, what did we need to do for an event, a festival where we were hosting 19 events. And one of the things is we have a very small team. It's myself and my colleague Amanda, who is behind the scenes today. Love her to follow her. She's amazing. We were a small team. And so when we transitioned, we have to make things as easy as possible. My theory with event planning is if you do really smart work up front and you use your money effectively, you can alleviate the amount of work, the amount of stress on your team. And you can sort of almost like create an additional staff member. So this is an example of how I alleviated some of the work. I knew that we wanted to use Zoom as our platform for delivering the content. I also knew that we wanted to use Eventbrite as our registration system. We want people to register, to have notifications. One of the things with Eventbrite that's really important to me that you can't do very easily on Zoom is you can actually email registrants. So you can say, oh my gosh, we forgot to tell you, bring your pen and paper, and you can email people directly through Eventbrite. And so Eventbrite is really a really good event space, and people also very familiar with it. They're using it a lot. And so we wanted to be able to use Eventbrite and link it with our website and to manage all the registrations. We wanted to know when people were registering, how they were finding out, all those sorts of things. I was able to print out really amazing stats and really cool graphs. After we were done the event, there was an app where I could follow how registrations were going. So we wanted to use that. Zoom, we initially registered for 500 people for a webinar. We had to increase that to 1,000 because, as I said, on Eventbrite, we were seeing these huge, significant registration numbers. But the key to this system was what I watched on a Zoom webinar was the use of Zapier. And Zapier is a website that essentially creates zaps or links to systems. And so what we did was we bought an account for Zapier, and every time someone registered for Eventbrite, they would automatically be registered for that matching Zoom webinar. This took a little bit of time for me to set up, like 2 whole days of building 19 events on Eventbrite, 19 events on Zoom, and then zapping them on Zapier. But it was so worth it. And we used it for this event as well. Some of you registered before I created this app. And so if you were having trouble and you didn't get the links and it didn't happen as smoothly, it's because I didn't zap you in time. But the zaps are really helpful. You pay per zap. You can pay monthly or you can pay yearly. So if you know that you're only going to use zaps for your festival, you can just sort of save and wait and only pay for like the month or 2 where you're actually going to need these apps. How much do these cost? I'm sure that's kind of a question that you're thinking about. If I recall, I want to say that the Zoom webinar function for 500 is something like, I had this for the last time and I can't remember and I don't want to mess it up. I want to say it's like $1,000 for the year, around $1,000, $2,000 for the year for 500 people in your webinars, if I recall. 500 people and 1 host is about almost $2,000. And then the Zapier one is about, I just did this one. I think it's like $30 a month for 1,000 zaps. And every registrant is a zap. So if you're having a like comprehensive event, we had to go much higher for the actual festival. But for something like this, it was easy for us to just do like a $30 thing. So that's how that system works together. I'm just going to check the question box to see if anything related to tech. Why you turned off the chat? Our troll is an issue. Some stuff over there. Okay, so somebody asked if I turned the chat, why I turned the chat off. Yeah, are trolls an issue was the question. Is that why I turned chat off? So for two reasons. Yes, I worry about trolls a lot. I worry about people just coming in and being disruptive. We also turned off the chat. We found that sometimes people started talking to each other or constantly posting questions. And when you're presenting, it becomes very difficult because the questions are coming up and you're thinking, oh my goodness, I need to answer that question. Oh my goodness, I need to answer that question. And so you're either being regularly interrupted by the chat, or people are talking, or the other thing that sometimes happens is you lose, the questions just become, they keep coming. And so it's very difficult for the presenter to cover all the content. In terms of our practice events, did we have just our staff or did we have presenters? We did both. So we did a couple. We would invite our planning team together, and we would do practice sessions with just our planning team. And then we did actual like live events. Our very first event was with the Kitchener Public Library. And so it was a smaller event, only 100 people. And so we were sort of let them know, like when it started, this is our practice one. We're not sure. So a question about Zapier. Does Zapier add any kind of additional security in terms of connecting people based on registered email addresses to the webinar, or is it strictly about saving time? It's both. I think there was also a big concern about how you get the information about the webinars without it being so forward facing. So Zapier allowed people to register for the event and then receive the registrant information privately without having to put the link for registration everywhere or share the webinar ID everywhere. So you essentially had to register in Eventbrite to get any kind of extra information. David Alexander shared that there's a Zoom discount available through TechSoup Canada. So that's just a really good plus for you. Okay, so this is a question. Zoom doesn't link to Instagram Live as well. No, I don't think so. A question about programming and moderators. Mehek, I'm going to answer that one when we get to the programming section, if that's okay, just so it's clear. Okay, so I'm going to, this is a picture of my team on the first day, just as a little commercial break, everyone. So that's Amanda and Monica and Chelsea. And so this is just a good reminder. We had about 4 people behind the scenes all the time on each of our events, and I'll explain what each of them did. But on the first day, they all decided to wear their blue fold shirts, and it was really cute, but also sad because I haven't seen them in a while. These were the roles and responsibilities that we laid out. We have a number of volunteers. So we have 3 groups of volunteers, I guess. We have our board, and then we have our planning team, and the planning team meets every month and works on programming. They're very invested in the material, the content, etc. And then we have our larger volunteers. So we had about 80 volunteers signed up, and unfortunately with the virtual format, it was just too much and too stressful to include all of those folks. And so we really limit it to our planning team, to the people who have been involved from the beginning and the people who we could do these sort of practice sessions with. And so every session, one of us, AKA myself or Amanda, was the tech or Zoom host. So we were the official Zoom host. We had control over everything. We were the ones that could turn videos off and on, mute on and off. We could control all those features. We also controlled, when we started and when the recording began and all those sorts of things. And so we were like the producers in a sense. We also had a tech assistant. The tech assistant would have a script, and when all the panelists would come on, we'd have the panelists, make sure your panelists sign up a half an hour before the event, because when they're late, it's very stressful. So it's good to know that they have the link and that you have time to recover. So our tech assistant would be there when the panelists logged on, and she would run through, or he would run through a script and explain how the event would go, right? Just like you would do in an in-person event, but they would review, okay, it's going to start at this time, it's going to end at this time, we're going to have a Q&A, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to do a reading, et cetera, et cetera. So they also monitored the Q&A box. So they would answer questions, any questions they could, they would answer them right in the Q&A box. So if it was something like, is this going to be available afterwards in video? They would just answer that so that it wasn't filling up the Q&A box with questions that had either could be answered that way. They also manage the time. So they would go into the chat feature and they would communicate with the panelists to say, okay, 5 minutes left. Your microphone is, if you could turn it up, or we can't quite hear you, or that kind of thing. They would be able to communicate directly with the speakers. And they also did a report at the end of the event. So they would share, okay, we had this many people at the highest point. We started to lose people at this point. And so they were really sort of keeping the whole report in check. We also had a session host, and our session host is a lot like what you probably have for your events already. So they're a reliable festival volunteer. They're the people who like to be in front of the camera. I literally had staff that were like, as long as I don't have to be on camera, I will be there. But if I do, I'm not. And then I had other people who were like, me. These are the me's. And they introduced the session. They did the land acknowledgement. They didn't have to have major familiarity with the tech, to be quite honest. They were essentially like another panelist. What I would say about your session hosts is really, in terms of diversity, really think about that they end up being the face of your organization. So really think about the face, what you're presenting, what you're showcasing about your organization if you're doing a lot of different events. And then the last role is one we didn't have but should have had, and that is session support. I think it's really important to have someone who has all the email addresses and phone numbers of all your panelists. That can also respond to tech or registration issues. So you may want to create an email account specifically for tech at your event, and this person, that would be their job. So leading up to the event, they're making sure that your panelists are actually there and calling them, finding out where they are if they're not. And then if there's something happening during an event, they're the ones that are going to email people back and say, you know, you can join on the phone if you're having trouble with the internet, or you can join us on Twitter, or whatever they're doing. They would have all that sort of like problem solving communications. Those are the 4 jobs that I would create. On this idea of tech, another role that you might have backstage has to do with language and accessibility. So when we do our panels for Fold, we always have captions. As opposed to ASL, you can have an ASL interpreter and they're another panelist. The thing to keep in mind when you have an ASL interpreter is that they need to be visible on the screen. I'll talk a little bit about programming, but if you're on a phone and watching something on Zoom, you know that you can only see 4 people, and then that the people after that get bumped and you sort of have to swipe back and forth. So you just want to make sure, and I'm not even sure how to do this, but you want to make sure if you have an ASL interpreter that they are visible all the time, especially right next to the content. And I'm not even sure that's possible if your panel is a lot bigger. So just keep that in mind. Captions are a really great option for supporting deaf and hard of hearing audience members who may not know ASL. And they also, you can also have captioning for different languages. You can do it in translation. That has happened before. We did an event, I linked to it, where one of our panelists spoke predominantly French. And so there was a captioner who would translate French to English. And that's like a feature within Zoom. You can actually see at the bottom CC for caption. So if you're using another platform, just make sure you understand accessibility and how you're going to accommodate disabilities through whatever platform that you're using. You want to think about it well in advance, look at the costs and build all that in to what you decide to do, rather than, okay, we're going to use this system, this plan, this program, and then find out afterwards it doesn't work, where you can't have ASL or captioning in any reliable way. How do captions work? Yeah, so how do the captions work? We have a company that does our captions, and the way they operate is they come on just like a panelist a half hour before the event. We have all their emails, so we add them as one of our panelists. And then when they come along, there's a little button that I press that makes them the captioner. If you're the host, you can do that. You make them the captioner, and then they use a third-party service. I don't understand. But I just have to copy a little code, pop it in their chat, and once they have that code, they start typing and things appear on the screen like magic. They're live transcribed right on the spot, and you can select with a captioner to have the transcript available afterwards. It's usually an additional fee, but that is an option, and that's something we like to do as well. If we're posting them on YouTube or somewhere else afterwards, we want to make sure that the transcripts are there. And that's not something that Zoom does. That's something we book on our own. Marketing and programming. So one of the things that's really interesting about virtual events is they sort of create a new opportunity. And one of the things I want to just encourage people, I know when we initially found out we were going virtual, there's lots of stress. There's lots of like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. It's not going to be the same. It's not going to be good. But we actually had a lot of really positive experiences from the virtual event. I still like to say I got a lot of laundry folded while listening to Fold events, and it was great. But one of the things I really encourage people to think about is the idea of a hyper local event and thinking about your event in that way. It can be tempting to try and capture like the entire world, or to think about, oh my gosh, anyone from anywhere can be tuning in, and like, how do we make sure people tune into us and that they don't get lost in something that somebody's doing in Vancouver or somebody's doing in Calgary. And I think the reality is the people who follow your event, the people who follow your festivals, they have their lives planned around going to your events. They know when they are, their followers, their fans, and you're really feeding that audience. You're really being loyal and true to the people who are regulars. And other people may jump in and they may catch on, but they may not. And what you really don't want to do is try to sort of abandon the audience that you already have to meet some mystical audience. I really believe that the people who follow I don't even know if they're at the same time, but people who follow Calgary WordFest are still going to follow Calgary WordFest events, even if there's something similar in Vancouver. I think there's a way of being involved in your community and being in the space that you're really like loyal to. And so I think just be hyper local, really focus on the people that are in your care, your current audience, do the things that you know they love, keep the things that you know they appreciate, and also think about the things that they need and the ways that you can provide them in new ways through a virtual festival. For Fold, people love our panels. They love the conversations that are created. And so we really wanted to keep those panels. If we couldn't do the panels, we couldn't have done the virtual festival. It wouldn't have worked. And so it's really important for us to keep that. We brought in Twitter conversations during those virtual events. People had Twitter conversations. We had people make art out of it. There's all sorts of things that happen that we never expected. So just be innovative, think about your space, think about what people want, what they get normally in an in-person experience, and how you can try and duplicate that online. So in terms of programming, keep your panels 4 people or less. I generally recommend when I'm doing it again, and we're planning on doing virtual events every year now. We're going to do a few virtual events and then lead into our in-person events. And so I'm actually going to keep our panels down to 3 as opposed to 4. In person, 4 is like our standard. In virtual, we're going to make it 3, because when you're on your phone or even on an iPad, it's just a really nice optic to see your moderator and then your 3 authors looking like, the Brady Bunch screen. Anything more and you have to start finding the 5th person and the 6th person or whatever. So keep your panels small. Really think about your underrepresented and your small press voices, and make sure you think about those underrepresented voices first, because you're going to be likely having fewer people, and because you're going to be having what I would recommend significantly less events than you normally would. Make sure that you sort of think about those underrepresented communities first. In terms of programming less than you normally would, I highly recommend that you do less than more. I think that, a lot of people talk about virtual, like Zoom fatigue and all these sorts of things. And I think that's true if you give them too much to choose from. I think if you can really lean it out and focus on the most important things and a variety of important things, you're actually giving some audience members a few events and other audience members a few events, and giving the hardcores like a whole 5 days of it. But you want to really make it so that it's digestible, and you also want to keep your stress down. So yeah, program less than you normally would. Highly recommend finding moderators who have a basic tech knowledge. It is really annoying / stressful / when your moderators are supposed to be in control and like know what's going on, and they don't know where any buttons are. So really try. And I mean, the thing now is that because it's virtual, you can get literally anybody to moderate. So really curate your moderators as well. I mean, your moderators to me are as important, maybe more than the panelists, but even more so when you're mixing in the Zoom technology, you want someone who understands, hey, so-and-so's screen just shut down. They'll be back in a minute. We're just going to keep on keeping on. And who knows like where the Q&A box is and how to handle those things. It's just, it makes the event a lot smoother when the moderator can actually be in control of the conversation. Mehek had a question about our decision to pay an additional webinar fee to panelists and moderators. So this is something that we did for a couple of reasons. So we get grants to pay our authors for the events and for other things as well. When we went into a virtual space, we were actually saving money in the sense that we weren't paying for hotels, we weren't paying for travel, all these sorts of things. I would say we have like a normal honorarium, but not a phenomenal honorarium. And so we felt like if we were not having to spend all this money on other things, plus, if there's a very likely chance that we weren't going to have as strong book sales, we wanted to make sure the authors walked away with more. And we always want to pay our moderators more because like, whoa, it's a lot of work. So we decided that part of the change and the shift, especially because some people lost events, was to add a webinar fee, a webinar honorarium on top of their honorarium so that we could actually pay everybody more for every event that they did. We paid them their per diem still, but then we also added this. And so I mean, I know money's tight. I know people are like trying to look at money in different ways, but really think about how you can prioritize your authors, how you can support them, especially in this new format with the money that you're saving. How can you also make sure your authors are walking away with more and being well supported? So that was sort of our decision behind giving an extra bit of money to everybody involved. Which brings me to a really good point about donations and book sales. So we have had a really great, this is our first year as a charitable organization. So it's the first time we've been on Canada Helps, and we've had a really easy donation process for people. So our donations are generally up. They did not reach, they were about 50% of what we would have got in ticket sales, which is good, but not like gonna solve the problem. But I think we did a rather, what I would say, a primitive campaign push. I mean, I think that was one of the things we thought about last. We had, again, 6 weeks. And so all of our efforts were into building the system, building the registration, making it work, making sure the authors knew where everything was. And then like in the week before, it was like, oh, what should we do about donations? So it came late. It wasn't as strongly planned. I would really encourage you to have a strong donation plan and process in place during your events. If I was doing it again, I would have built a donation piece into every registration so that when you register, you always have the option of donating through Eventbrite. Book sales were down, but we were also in a weird spot with book sales because at the time it wasn't even sure if it was safe to deliver things. So there was different opinions about whether books should even be like arriving at people's doors and people should be buying books. And so we didn't even it was like a very weak push for book sales because we were nervous about that. Obviously Audible's a big sponsor of ours and we could push that kind of thing going to your library. And so we would mention books, but again, next year for any virtual events, even for our kids events, we're thinking very carefully about how to tie in book sales. And again, that's not about Fold getting more money, it's about the authors getting value. The whole point of festivals is to raise awareness for authors to get their books out there and their books read. So that was what we were doing. If I were to recommend something, you're doing a literary event, try and think about how you can get autographed copies, maybe how a certain place can be your point place for shipping them out, having a free chat about like a free opportunity for like a one place that they go to where they send them and a free shipping available for that. So those were some of the main things. I'm going to look at the question and answer box. So Ashley asked if we use PowerPoint for the slideshow or another app, how do you display slides side by side with showing panelists? Yes. So One of the other reasons we chose Zoom was because our previous program, you could either show your PowerPoint or you could show your face. You can show both at the same time. And I thought it was really important to have this kind of option. So you can do it this way. I don't know, and I have not seen where you have PowerPoint and you can have multiple panelists. I've only seen it where you have one speaker and the PowerPoint. So in terms of the answer to that question, if you wanted to have a PowerPoint showing up as people were talking, you would want to maybe check out some of the more advanced webinars on it. The other thing that you can look at is branding. So if you get a large enough account, or if you like spend enough money with things, you can get a branded look to your actual Zoom platform and your Zoom presentation. I know a couple other places have also done pre-recorded virtual events. So they actually like record the videos and then they can create this sort of a more branded look than we're able to do when we do them live on the spot. So that's another way that virtual events can work. You can have your virtual event be live, but actually have it pre-recorded and available to people afterwards. I was asked to share a little bit about breakout rooms. I have not actually used breakout rooms. I'm going to be using breakout rooms for our kids event. So I'm just going to be doing some practice sessions myself. My son has used them for basketball. I don't know how they work on an administrator end, but on the actual like experience end, people register and you can have them assigned to a room in advance, and then they just get sent off to their room. It sounds magical, and it is. But it means that you can get people to sign up for, I'll give you an example, for a kids workshop on illustration. You want to do illustration, and you can actually break them up by age category. So you can have all the 4 to 8-year-olds go in one space and all the 9 to 16-year-olds go into another place, or however you want to break it down, which just means that you're able to curate a more unique experience. Audrey, great question. In the future, will you charge for virtual events? I would pay. If so, is there a cost for using Eventbrite for tickets? So Eventbrite does have a fee, like our in-person events are paid events, and they pay a fee, and then it takes off a little bit of the cost. You can absorb the fee, so you can have that you pay it, and you can build it into your ticket price, or you can have it be an add-on. General rule of thumb is that people get just a little pause when there's extra fees, so it's better to set your ticket price higher and absorb the Eventbrite fee than to have them see that they're paying an Eventbrite fee. So just a little trick there. In terms of would we charge for virtual events, our events, I don't think we would. I think for us, we're really trying to think about how to make events accessible and how to make them reach people. That's a really good important mandate for us. It's important for us to reach people who are marginalized, who don't know, who aren't sure. And so our virtual events were really great because they allowed us to hit everybody without. The only barrier was internet. If you didn't have internet access, we had to think about people who were phoning in and listening. But I think we'll always try and keep our virtual events free. There is a way to charge people though, either through the Eventbrite function. I think Zoom also has a paid feature. I think they do. I can't remember. But yeah, you can charge people. A lot of people are doing it. Gritlet's been doing events where they charge people for their virtual events, particularly their workshops. I suspect that in the fall, people will be charging for some. But again, I mean, it's a really, my big thing is if you look at what your budget was and what you're spending because you're virtual, it's very different. And like, can you actually manage without charging people is a great question to ask. If you can't, how much? What are some of your other options? Is there a way to embed a clickable link to where people can purchase books, for instance, onto the moderator's screen on Zoom? There is a way to create a clickable link through the chat. So even though people can't chat with you, I don't know if I want to risk it, but I could send a message out. And what I would actually do is I'd have my team have a code and they could actually pop it into the chat. So you could have people say like, hey, this event's over. We're popping the link in to buy these books. And you just click on it and it would take you right to the page. So there is a way to share clickable content. We share the most clickable content through our follow-up emails on Eventbrite. That's the easiest way for us. That's what we did for the festival. Just because then people have it. They can click on it right away. They can do it on their own pace. because if you ask them to do it and it's the end of the event and then you close it, they don't have access to that link anymore. So that's, and also if you put it there, then they're likely to click on it and then leave the screen. So you have to sort of navigate when they're going to click on it and how that's going to work. Oh, Curtis, great question. How did you find turnout versus registration numbers? Were there any variables you noticed that affected the audience turnout? Yes, this is really important, actually. So we had about a 50% turnout ratio. So even in the events where we were like 500 creeped up, we actually had events sell out at 1,000. So what we did was on Eventbrite, we set it at 1,000. And every time somebody registered on Eventbrite, it obviously creates a Zoom registrant. And so we had 1,000 people, but then only like 400, 600 would actually show up to the virtual event. So you end up having these spaces that people didn't use. What we did for some of them was we actually, when people canceled, we cleared out those names. And then we actually had like almost like a rush tickets, like 15 minutes before the event, there was like 20 more tickets and people would go in and pick those up. I don't think there's any way to avoid it, really. Any type of free event, you're going to have like about those kinds of numbers where people will say they come and they don't. And that's why paid events are really effective for in-person, because you don't want to be saving seats for people who don't come. So what I would recommend, or what I would have done differently, is I would actually open registration a lot later. So what we were doing is we opened up registration like normal, like a month in advance, and people were like, woo, they register. But I probably would have had the information available, but not opened the actual registration until like maybe 2 weeks beforehand, maybe even a week. I think our virtual event push would be different next time around. I would have it like, hey, these events are happening, this is coming, but I would have like a virtual day where the registration for our virtual events opens, so that you have a much accurate sensibility of who's actually going to come. That's something I would try in the future, just not as much of a lead time in the registration process. Was there anything in particular that affected it? Like, did I notice it was like, you know, when it was nighttime versus daytime? No, it was pretty consistently 50% turnout ratio. The only thing that had a higher turnout ratio was the workshops had a higher number. So they were probably like 60%, 70% turnout ratio, as opposed to the 50% of the events. In terms of internet access, did you have any challenges with panelist participants having limited connectivity or interfering with their participation? So no, actually, we didn't have major issues with people's internet glitching. Sometimes in the initial moment, like right when the camera, like we would stop the video and then we would pull the video up. Sometimes in that moment there could be glitches, just like sometimes when you're signing into a Zoom event and you're ready to go and then it comes on and sometimes you're not, you're bumped out. There was like moments like that, but once people were in, the internet worked well. There weren't major delays between presenters. We did tell people to have all their family members off the internet at the same time to shut it down, because that does affect your ability to have a good strong signal, is if there are multiple people in the house watching Netflix, streaming, whatever. That can affect the speed, the conversation. So we had instructions that we sent to authors to sort of say, like, for the hour and 10 minutes, don't have anybody watching the webinar with like on another device unless they're on a different internet source, and just sort of those things. Anna asks, for writing workshops, can you talk about how you'd handle people asking questions and sharing their work, going back and forth, taking turns reading, etc.? Yes. Workshops were a tricky bag. Most of our presenters tried to do a little bit more of a, like something like this, like a talk and then a Q&A. If you wanted to share back and forth, I think that it's possible. I maybe wouldn't use the webinar feature in the same way, or I would use the webinar feature, but I would open up some of those things like chat and some of those functions you might open up to. If you're doing that though, I strongly recommend a much smaller group. Because it's just a lot to take in and to manage. So if you're thinking that you have a particular framework for your workshops that you want to maintain, just really sort of identify your priorities and work from your priorities out. So our priority when we were doing panels was safety and security. Like we worked from that point into the event. And we did the same with workshops because we just weren't sure. I mean, at the time there was like all this like Zoom bombing, it's crazy that all this things happen. And it still happened. It never happened to us, thank goodness. But we did want to be really cautious and probably overly cautious about that. So just be thinking about how you can manage it. Again, I think if you have like 20, 50 people in a workshop, it's pretty easy to shut somebody down if they're being obnoxious. But you do want to make sure that your team knows how to deal with that as well. How did you handle questions, participation from people who call in via phone? We didn't do any questions from people who called in through the phone. We did questions via Twitter. So people could ask questions on social media and we would pose those in the group, or we would just answer them online, or people would just answer them. It was kind of exciting. What scheduling would you recommend? Events over 5 days, 3 days, 2 weeks, 1 month? Okay, so this is a really good question from Emily. I think it's about how much you are able to do and how much you need to do, which is a tricky thing to say. We did events for the 3 Saturdays before the fold. So our first one was that practice one with the library. And then we did with like our pre-festival event, which was like as real as we could get. But we wanted to essentially like try things out, make corrections over the week, try things out, make corrections over the week. And then we did our full weekend. I liked that framework for our first time for a virtual event. That worked really well for us. Next year, I would probably just have a few events. I wouldn't have to do this sort of, I might do a practice event in ahead of time, but maybe not. It depends. For those of you that are starting out, I would not do like 4 days in a row 5 days in a row was a bit exhausting. If I could do it right, I probably would have done 3 or 4, and I would have had 3 to 5 events a day max. Probably 4 would be like where you should cut it off. Like don't have more than 4 events a day. I don't know why I said 5. We did 6 one day and 5 another day. And those days were like, so you want to make sure you have a good transition time between your events to get reset up and recalibrated. So yeah, I would say there's not an easy like one size fits all answer. Some of you are doing series, some of you are doing festivals, but I would give yourself practice times. I would think about practice more so than like how long and how many days. How much time do I need from the first time we do like a practice event to the time we actually get to our bulk prime time kind of events? And then how do I build those prime time event days so that people can function, both my team and the people watching? So I'd ask those kinds of like philosophical questions, but generally speaking, 4 events a day is like the max. 5 in an emergency, especially like if your 5th is something very different, whole different audience. We had one day we did 6, and the 6th event was like a dance party spoken word event, and it was amazing, but totally different audience. So but it was the 6th event, so I was like did you consider pre-recording events? How critical do you think it was that the conversation and events were happening live? I think if you don't know that they're pre-recorded, it can be okay, but there's something about it that feels off to me. So I really liked having live conversations. I think that for us, the live panels plus the Twitter conversations really created the dynamic that we like about our in-person events. And I think a pre-recorded event has a different experience, like a podcast. And so your expectations are different, your participation is different. And so it's just a matter of thinking if that works. What does your audience normally like? Are they into the question and answer period, or do they like listening to readings? Readings is something, if you're just going to have a series of readings, you can easily do that pre-recorded. We have done a series where we pre-recorded conversations that we're releasing on YouTube, and they're great. I think they're going to be great, but they have a very particular approach. I think the panels are about like live, duking it out, responding to what's really happening right now. I think that's really important. I think I covered most things. I want to mention Mahek shared that there was a book webinar where they automatically opened a browser page that led to a book order page when the webinar closed. It was a great prompt to encourage people to buy books. expect us to research that and maybe put it into practice. Thanks, Meg. Okay, so that is, unless I see other questions pop up, I am going to peace out. But if you do want to make a donation to Fold, we wanted to make this free because we don't want their barriers. But if you do want to make a donation to the Fold Foundation at Canada Helps, we'd obviously welcome them and appreciate them. And we hope we can put it to good use. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for listening, participating. Those were amazing questions. I hope I answered them. If you have additional questions, or if you just want to like mention something to me, my email is director@thefoldcanada.org. So that's director@thefoldcanada.org. And just a pleasure being here with you.